All right, it's Mr. Clark again with the AP Government Argument Essay Practice Session. We're looking at the second and third FRQ argument essays and talking about the rubrics. We went into the strategies last time in the first episode. This is episode 2, and we'll get started. Okay, the second argument essay dealt with education and the amount of impact and control the federal government should have. Should the federal role be expanded or not? And so this is essentially a federalism debate. Should the national government be able to make and control this? And of course, we got these same kind of cast of characters here. Brutus is involved, making the case for the states. Fed 10 making the argument in the other direction from James Madison. And again, take a look at this. If you have not had a chance to work on this, feel free to just pause the video, brainstorm what you would do, how you would take these different documents and in what direction, and just use the rest of this as sort of a guide as you go forward. And of course, you could go with the off-ramp and decide not to talk about two documents. You could take something else related to the impact of federalism. That would be totally fine. So if you took the pro-federal stance and said, okay, an active national government is necessary in public education because, and so you're saying, yes, we need more or at least the same amount of activism. You'd have to have your line of reasoning to support that. And you could actually have both of your arguments, depending on how you couch this, relating to equality. In other words, you could have something about the equal rights of women in education or racial equality or the disabled. You could focus on any of those areas and just sort of segment that and say, look, we need to make sure that the discrimination that is related to kids with disabilities needs to be. And so there's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was passed in the 1970s to promote protection of kids with learning disabilities, and a lot of the federal rules that come out of that. You could talk about that. You could talk about the role of Title IX in promoting equality for women in education. You could talk about the legacy of segregation, that the states don't have a great track record when it comes to education in terms of making sure that equality and equal rights are promoted. And so all of that fits in, and so you could literally break this up into segments, make them separate arguments and talk about them, or just make it a larger argument and have a bigger, more supporting details that fit into it. But it wouldn't be hard to tie this back to your thesis and just say, look, we need to make sure that the equality and equal rights of students is guaranteed. And of course, with the documents that were listed in the question, you could take this down and maybe this is part of what your planning was for this, if you're looking at this question, the 14th Amendment, of course, the Equal Protection Clause. So if you said the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause denies states the ability to have discriminatory practices and laid out all of the role that the national government has taken in these areas, whether it's the Civil Rights Act or whether it's enforcing Brown versus Board of Education or whatever pathway you wanted to talk about, any of that would be fine. But you could tie it back to the 14th Amendment and make that constitutional linkage that's there. Fed 10 might be a little harder because you have to say, okay, Madison was worried about about majority tyranny, and of course this is a problem on a small scale of politics, which was his argument. And if we widen the scale of politics, we'd have a less of a risk of this problem coming up, and we'd have a much broader protection of minority rights than if everything was on a smaller scale, which is easy to have a majority faction form. So that would be definitely a good approach. An off-document argument that you could make, an off-ramp could involve the inequality among states. One of the disadvantages of federalism, where states are doing their own things, is, of course, the inequality of state resources. And so when it comes to education, you've got so many different funding levels. States are all over the place when it comes to how per pupil spending is just so varied across the country. So the gap between, states that have resources and states that lack it, and they got higher poverty rates. And you bring in, if you were making this argument on this side, a pro-federal side, is that we need the national government to intervene to provide not just an equality of opportunity, but also just equality of financial support. And so going back into the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson, the War on Poverty, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act, and all of that ties into this argument. And you could say, look, this supports my thesis because we need the national government to sort of level the playing field to provide better access for education. And so it's not just about breaking down legal barriers, but also financial and economic inequalities that come into this as well. All right, what about the state side? If you were going to take the state side argument, some of you may have chosen to take that totally defensible argument to make on the issue of education. Where could you go? One of the things, of course, with the thesis, we talked about this last time, the national government should not expand its role in education because, so you've taken a stance, this is the national government should not expand its role because, and then you have to play into your line of reasoning. What is going on? Why is the national government generally going to be a poor, a weak add-on to the educational role? And that would be a good place to go. So constitutionally speaking, of course, you're thinking about this, brainstorming, how can I use the Constitution to support a states' rights kind of position, pro-federalism position? And of course, the 10th Amendment is a perfect example of this, that education is a reserve power, it's left to the states, it's not a delegated power. And so constitutionally speaking, the fact that the national government intervenes, frequently it is tied to educational grants and the conditions that are put on aid, and not because the national government has any kind of delegated or enumerated power in this area. So that could certainly be, if you were going to make a constitutional argument based on the documents for this question, that would be really good. And of course, if you're accessing your own sort of packets of information, anytime you get a federalism question, look at the stuff that talks about the impacts of federalism. What are the pros and cons? What are good things and bad things about federalism? And in this case, you'd be looking for what's good about federalism. Why should states get more influence over education? All right. So if you're on team state, if you're taking that position, and in this case, this kind of idea about popular control, and you can see this response here. The national government is going to be further away from the people. States are closer. The parents are going to have more of an influence. Local control means the public input and participatory democracy are going to be expanded. Those are going to be, you've got this sort of like power to the people kind of argument. And of course, the document that's associated with that, if you were going to use this as a you could make this as an off argument and just talk about this as a reason for the states to do this. But obviously, a really good route to take would be to say, this is Brutus, okay? The states need to be able to do their own thing. The national government being strong means the government is going to be distant from the public, and the people won't really have a role to play. It's going to be controlled by elites and these outsiders, and so the smaller the scale of democracy, the better, because the public is going to be able to kind of drive what happens. So again, this example has that sort of reasoning piece. This supports my thesis because the inability of local citizens to control the educational, they won't be accountable to the people, and that's a bad thing for the states and for the public. The next one, same kind of argument. It also works with Brutus. You could use Brutus for this. Brutus talks about all these sort of anti-federalist states' rights arguments. If we make this, if we have a nationally driven educational policy, we're not going to be able to get the benefit of federalism when it comes to customization. That the flexibility that you have with the state and local, they can customize educational needs based on what their state environment is, what the context of the states is. And so a one-size-fits-all policy isn't going to work for that. So No Child Left Behind, as an example where inflexible rules create a lot of, backlash when it comes to educational professionals and teachers and school districts just not liking all that federal micromanagement of what's happening. And so all that frustration means better for the states to be able to drive this. Our last thing, if you were going to go totally off ramp and just make an argument in favor of federalism, of state control, gets into this whole experimentation argument that states are laboratories of democracy. If we leave things to the states, they can come up with new reform ideas, try them out, and then the rest of the country won't be harmed as a result of that. So that, you probably heard about that earlier in the course. And so, just tying it in, this means we get benefits from leaving it to the states as opposed to some sort of national top-down policy. Okay, so those would be sort of the general pathways that would make sense on this particular question. So if you were brainstorming and you went in those directions, nice job. Okay, our third question dealt with representation models in Congress, trustee, delegate, and so forth. What's the best argument? Which model serves the intent for the Constitution best? And in this case, again, you're going to have to take a position. The trustee, theory is best represents the intent of the framers, the Constitution, because, and then lay it out of their fear of popular government, and that they were worried about the people having too great an influence over this, majority rule or the mob or whatever. You could take it the other way and make a completely different argument. But again, Brutus is back here as our power to the people, power to the states, national government's a threat, Federalist 10, people are to be worried about, the majority can form a faction that becomes tyrannical and treads on the rights of the minority. Same kind of idea, that you can play into addressing all of this. And I didn't really break this down into, just in terms of like, what do the different models represent? And again, for Brutus, it is all about the idea that the smaller the scale of politics, the better the representatives are going to know what the people in their districts want and reflect those needs when they're voting. And that's true for Brutus. That's democracy in action, power to the people. They would be able to give their assent to what the laws are. The people that are making these decisions are going to reflect what the people want. And that, if we extend the country too far, how will the representatives know what their people really want? And, it would make it hard for them to discern that kind of will from the public. And we can't have real democracy on a large scale. We've got to keep it on a small micro scale. Okay, so that's basically the burden on all this. Of course, Fed 10, Madison is making a very different argument, which is if we leave government to the local populations, they're going to have a very narrow point of view. They're going to have a very narrow perspective, and they are going to become a threat to the society, that this majority faction is going to be able to, tread on the rights of the minority. The local prejudices, the factious tempers are going to be a greater threat if we have a small scale of politics. And so it's better if we widen the range of representation, expand the republic and the size of the republic, and have a situation where the representatives are going to refine and enlarge the public view, meaning the public needs, it's a little rough around the edges. We need something where we need a trustee system where they don't necessarily follow exactly what the people want at all times. So anyway, that would have been the key things for this pathway if you were looking at this one. Thanks for tuning in for episode 2, and we'll have some things on set 2 coming up.